Okay, well, welcome everyone to our 12th session of Well Read, our Women Educational Leadership Reading Group. And we're thrilled to have today the author of this book that we have been engaged in and reading and thinking about and discussing with us to listen in on the conversation and to contribute. And we have some of our contributors, joiners, listeners also online. So welcome to Elizabeth and Jenny. Who are here, I believe both from Australia now. So not as many EDT time zone folk because it's 6 a.m. right now. So apologies for that. And we're so grateful for Jenny Weiner to join us at that time because I know she's in the same time zone as I am. So I wanted to introduce the group. So this is our little group that formed at a conference not that long ago and just wanted to continue to talk about women's educational leadership and think about our own roles and how we can wrestle with some of the ideas and keeping us accountable by assigning books and then recording conversation. So those of you who are joining us, we're really, really glad to see you. We hope that this sparks some thinking for you and feel free to come and join us anytime. So first of all, let me start with Andrea. Would you want to do a quick intro for those who maybe don't know who you are?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Andrea Stringer. I am currently in Brisbane, but I usually reside in Sydney, Australia. 12th time we have got together, so I love these times together. It does make you accountable to actually read and put everything else aside for a little bit of time. So love being with the group. And yes, I'm graduating at the end of this month, so it's been a long 5 years, but very excited about that. So, and thanks for all of your support. You have helped me all along the way. So I wanted to say thank you. Rana and Trista especially.
We're so thrilled to have Dr. Stringer on the line today, and it's been such a great journey, and you've been such a powerhouse through it. So thanks so much, and congratulations! First time we've had a chance to see each other on screen. How about you, Rania?
So congratulations again, and thank you everyone for joining us. It's always so refreshing and so inspiring to be with you ladies, to have our lovely discussions and inspiring insights that we always share to get us away from usually what we have to do or what we want to do. But this is something so refreshing for us. And we're super happy to have you, Jenny, and also Elizabeth, and everyone who's watching and will be joining us soon. I have PhD in education leadership. I'm originally from Jordan, and I currently live in Qatar. So we have a different time zone. It's noon here. And, like wearing different hats, something that we will be sharing during our discussion and kind of experiences that we're having. But it's always so lovely to be with you ladies.
Thank you, Rania. And I'm Trista, and I think we all need to update our images here, right, Dr. Stringer, as I noticed as I'm looking here. I'm working at the University of Ottawa as an adjunct, teaching, coaching, and mentoring, and of course in social emotional learning this year, but also supporting educational leaders and thinking about my newest job is now leading a research project on teachers' professional learning in Sierra Leone. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what's happening next. So that's an update for Rania and Andrea. That's what I'm up to this year as we move forward. But we really want to dig into the book because we only have this precious time together. And so please do, if you have a chance to add yourselves, we love to see where folks are coming from and to get this cross section of different contributions, and reach out to us anytime. I know that Rania keeps us on her social medias and always checks for us. So that's helpful. And we have a full professor in the house. So congratulations. We're really, really thrilled to see. I just make sure that my bar is not blocking the picture. Congratulations, Dr. Weiner, on full professorship. And it was really enlightening for me to see that how few women move into full professorship. And so I can see this is making some good trouble. We look forward to seeing what's next where your work. And I understand that you're working at the University of Connecticut. Our paths have crossed through AERA's Educational Change SIG. Where you're leading it, and I know that
not anymore.
You just passed on the reins, okay? But also just the thank you after such a busy time. I know that was just happening, so thank you for coming and joining us today. And we really look forward to seeing all the work that you're doing with women leaders. I was fascinating to hear about how your work presenting and defending, I think, for women representing in court system. I don't know if you'd like to share a little bit about the work you do in general, but that stood out to me as something of interest.
Sure, sure. Do you now, or would you like to?
Sure, why not? It's a casual conversation. So yeah, tell
Oh,
us a
okay.
little bit about what you
Yeah.
want to tell us.
Yeah. Well, I would just say, I mean, I think the book is representative of the work that I'm doing now. I mean, I tend to think about my work a little bit more expansively too, in terms of, reframing leadership itself as something that's more equitable in terms of outcomes, but also in terms of who gets access to it and how we construct it, and making it more liberatory and oriented towards positive change. So with it under that kind of umbrella, right, like the sort of I would say anti-feminist orientation, and at least in the US context, highly white orientation of leadership really is deeply embedded in how we do our training, how people come to understand and conceptualize it, and therefore how people come to enact it. And in many ways, that kind of orientation is antithetical towards creating the kind of environments that people want to work in and thrive in and are able to grow and learn positively. So, I'd say anything that has to do with that, which is quite expansive in orientation, but allows me to do lots of interesting things. So I appreciate that. I actually did a big project in Jordan for a long time, so I'm happy to see representation of that as well. We're working with the Queen Rana's Leadership Academy. So I get to do all sorts of things all over. In terms of the being an expert witness, which was really fascinating because, well, it's totally something I didn't know how you get to do that. And it is really fascinating to use an academic perspective to try to convince a jury, right, of people who perhaps have never thought about these issues or may not want to, right, how to bring them along and name discrimination in the context of workplace, but also not alienate them in any way, right? Like, because you're trying to build empathy or sympathy for the person who's being, for the person that you're representing. But I think in academia, to some extent, I can just present how I feel like it and people can take it up or not. Obviously, I'm trying to be, persuasive and inviting and all those things, but, I don't have to worry about at any moment it affecting an individual to the extent that they won't be able to be fairly compensated or receive what they deserve. So it was really interesting about, sort of reframing my entire arguments in the context of a legal framework. And I could talk more about that too, in terms of, I think, shifting norms about how discrimination is understood in our legal system, particularly as it pertains to gender and gendered racism, which is obviously my focus. But, weirdly, I think we've had some positive momentum, given all the other terrible things that are happening relative to women's rights in the United States context. But people seem to be understanding discrimination a little bit differently. And I might think the Black Lives Matter movement is part of that as well, right? Like how people come to understand discrimination, not just as people yelling things or pinching women's bottoms, but rather, the sort of how it's embedded and operationalized in many of our systems around hiring, promotion, review, all those kinds of things. I'll stop talking now.
Well, it's fabulous because it gives us insight into the book. I think you're absolutely right. As I listen to you speak, I have an understanding through reading the book a little bit deeper about some of these ideas that you just shared quickly with us, and also how important not only educational leadership is for schools and school systems, but how it can impact the greater societal understanding of structures as well. So I'm really, that's really helpful. So thank you so much. And we also want to acknowledge that you have a co-writer. So
I
Monica
do.
that came with you. So unfortunately, she's not with us today, but thank you for joining us and representing.
Of course.
But just, I love that it was a co-authored. And it is this idea of sisterhood working together. And so that was a great example, seeing that in
And
this.
she was my mentor too. So thank you for acknowledging her. She was my doctoral advisor. So there
Okay.
is life. So Andrea, there is life. You still like people that mentor you later, 10, 20 years later. So there you are. That's which feels important given the slog that we all go through.
And some of the women here have been my people I go to. So yes, that's why you keep them close, right?
It's amazing. We always start with just the structure of the book for those folk who haven't had a chance to pick it up. And before we go in and dive into the conversation, it's a book that must be read. I think it's a really powerful contribution to the discussion. And there aren't a lot of books actually being written right now at this time on women or educational leadership. Love the phrasing of that. And also there was the call for more, not only women to read the book, but all leaders and everyone who is interested in educational leadership to be picking this book up and to have the conversation. So an excellent contribution. And we're so glad that we found it. And I know that it's now at the University of Ottawa Library as an option because I think it's one of the books that we need to be thinking about. Just wanted to start a little bit with, this is my perspective after reading the book. It really felt, and I know you acknowledge at the very end that this can make you sad sometimes, really confronting some of the issues, and also angry, and that we should embrace the anger. But there did seem like the feel of you, this is the situation. So how we move forward, there are going to be pushbacks on either way, and that we really need to think about what's moving forward. And I love that you had Carol Shakespeare provide. Rania and I had a good chance to work very closely with her work in a book that we did on thinking about women's educational leadership in the Global South. And so found it must feel really great to have someone acknowledge, but also highlight that this is still the same conversation. It's different, but 50 years later, we're still having the same conversation, but that there is this path forward about resisting and thriving. And so that stood out to me as a lovely contribution and really powerful words from someone that's been so inspiring. Because I'm leading the conversation, I get to pull the things that stood out the most to me, and we will open it up obviously to our other book members. But I did wanted to highlight, because this sent me on a bit of a rabbit hole. So thank you to Jenny for highlighting. So this is in the US in 2018, NCS. I think these are the stats that came from. So teachers were 75% women, principals 54%, and that you were able to identify 6% Black women at that point. But then the data gets a bit murky when we look at 27% superintendents, and we don't know how many women who are of other races are identified, but 2% are African American. Those could be men or women. We don't know because it's not disaggregated data. So I wanted to know, like, what's going on in Canada? I hear in Australia, there's I find a lot of contributions from women writers around education and the data, and the US, but I was wondering, like, what's happening, what's the data in Canada? And interestingly, we actually are doing quite well in terms of numbers. So we have similar strong numbers of teachers, but our principalship is around 62%. This was a 2021 from Statistics Canada, so I had to actually get into Statistics Canada and work with the data to find it out, because it's not anywhere. That was one of the big things that surfaced for me. And then when we were looking at principals, yes, we have 60%. It's not parity exactly to the numbers of teachers, but it is, over 50%, which is great. But we need definitely more representation. They didn't disaggregate data from elementary, secondary, superintendent, principal, vice principal. So we have absolutely no idea what the distribution across that number is. And even though there is a solid growth upward, a trend upward, we don't know what's really the picture. And then it made me think, like, why are we not capturing any of this data, and do we really care? So that's the question. So why this book is, why do we care? Should we care? And, like, ultimately, emphatically, yes, we should care, but we need to have a conversation. So I'm happy to share some of that with you later too, Jenny, if you're interested. So the couple of the the highlights, again, I get as leader of this conversation, get to highlight for me, and really is thinking about this double bind and the dilemma that we have, that you're, you know, competent or likable, but not both, and how we're fitting into specific gender roles, and those are stereotypes, and what does leadership look like? And it led me down another rabbit hole of what's educational leadership and then what's women's educational leadership, and how are we understanding these two concepts, and what does that mean for the women who lead, who, you know, want to push and have agency and authority, but also lead in a way that maybe is different from previous leadership styles. So this really stood out to me as a key context that I hadn't encountered in my admin work as well, and training or support. And so it's nice to be thinking about it. And then that led me to the care work and emotional labor component. Beyond what happens at home, I was really thinking about the work that happens in the schools, like who provides the snacks for the staff meetings, who are the main mentors. I work a lot in mentoring and coaching, so I'm always thinking about who's taking on that role, and where does that lead folk? Does it lead into principalships, superintendencies? What kind of leaderships, department heads taking on? Is it paid? Is it recognized? So I just wanted to maybe at this point to highlight, Andrea, Rania, did anything stand out from these two pieces that I shared that stood out for me?
Yeah, thank you for leading this discussion, Tristan, for sharing those insights as a start. For me, if we go back to the content slide and starting from there, as Jenny had shared some of her current roles, it's really interesting how each of those chapters you had started with identifying frameworks, and then having cases at each of every chapter, with having some questions after those cases. So for me, it kind of was really interesting the way that you had structured the book, and the way that you had presented, and the how you're sharing the information. And while you're talking about an expert witness, that made lots of sense for me, because while I was reading, you're using words like victim, legalization, and things. And otherwise, why do I feel like we're in a court, you know? So that kind of it resonated with me. For me, like after I'm reading the case, the question was, do you agree, like, she is a victim or not? So I was thinking, why are we continuously using this word instead of having different terminology or different way of presenting it? And the second thing was like, it made me rethink of every single situation I faced or I'm still facing, because like, do I need someone to clarify the situation and to tell me, is this type, or is it a normal kind of discussion, or is it kind of discriminate? Like this kind of inner voice is continuously now reflecting and trying to understand what's the difference between having a normal conversation, or that someone who was really biased, or he's really kind of bullying, or whatever words that we will be using in this situation. And when you're sharing the statistics, Trista, it made me also think of like, there was no mention kind of Arabs or Muslims. I know there are many lives in the United States, or maybe even in our case, but I know that it's very hard to share some of those statistics because we have a different schooling system in our region. Females teach schools, they have female teachers, and definitely they're going to have female principals. So those statistics does not apply in our case, especially in the Gulf area. Maybe in Morocco or different countries where they have mixed gender kind of schools, that would be a different case, which I don't have a statistic or more kind of facts. So there are lots of questions that had been. And the last comment that, you know, like you have a very kind of rich terminology that I had a long list. If I show you like my notebook, it's like every single, oh my God, how many terminologies, like I need to go and search and Google, and then, you know, like come back and try to think deeply, which one am I going to be using in the future, you know, like just to reflect this and to express this in the right way. So thank you for presenting it in so nicely and so rich with the information, and also with the way that you had. There are lots of things that we will be discussing across the chapters, and, you know, like the other points, but I will leave now for Andrea.
Thanks for that, Rania. Yeah, actually, Trista, can you go back to the contents page? Because what I'm looking at it from why I loved the book more than the content, but I think anybody can pick up this book and read one chapter and actually use it in a group setting with a whole lot of people and unpack it together. I think that's sharing the stories across. And I read the end and it said, you know, some people get angry and some people get sad. I actually felt that because I'm like, oh, I know that situation. I've experienced that. And so it really resonated with me. And I don't think you have to be a leader to have that experience. I think it happens throughout your aspirational to be a leader. And so I kept relating it to Mia, or when I'm coaching people, they've told their stories. And while they vent and unpack, yes, but how are you going to move forward? And how can I support you to move forward from this? Acknowledge it, but also think of how to go forward. So that one, with all the statistics, I actually didn't look at any of the statistics. I think, Trista, that's an amazing thing to do. And I think now you've given me a job to do tomorrow, because I will look in Australia. But yeah, we don't have the superintendents and things like that. So it's a different context as well. But I'm eager to get into, I loved the case studies because I felt that they told the story, and then you could unpack that within your context. It doesn't matter where you are in the world, but whoever you're with, you can unpack that. And so I loved the way, you know, even with agency, you explained what agency was for you in this book. You know, it's the ability for someone to initiate and act, ideally without the fear of retribution or violence. I just felt that you made that very clear when you spoke about it. And I love the coaching throughout the process, but, you know, helping acknowledge other women who provide some really interesting, or even supporting them and acknowledging them explicitly in a meeting. I thought, that's something I've never done. I do that behind the scenes. I might tap someone on the shoulder and say, I loved what you presented. You did an excellent job. You should be so proud. But I don't do it explicitly in front of other people. And I think that's something I've taken away now, how I can improve and support other women coming through. So thank you for that, Jenny.
Maybe Jenny, do you want to respond? It is a very formal conversation, so we generally give our highlights and then we'll dig in a little bit.
Oh my gosh! First of all, I'm so moved and touched. So thank you all for taking it, you know, picking it up, and it sounds like really engaging with it. So thank you so much. I wanted to go back a little bit and thinking about the why. Also, Trista, evoke for me and Rana's comments as well. So all of it is to name a problem, which of course I think you picked up on well. I think the other thing that I'm trying to do is, and it actually relates to Cheryl's comments as well, in terms of, you know, 50 years later, how depressing, which is, I think that so much of the conversation regarding what is happening really is oriented, or has been very much oriented, to individual women either succeeding or failing. Right. The discussion has really been about, and even today, right? Like there's been it was interesting recently, the Harvard Business Review did a woman commentary about, you know, the proliferation of women's leadership pipeline programs and whether or not that may actually be, could be harmful in some ways, which I can explain in a few minutes. But and one thing is that, you know, I'm often asked to speak, and sometimes I'm asked to speak literally. I'm not joking here, where someone called me and said, can you come and tell women how to be less intimidating during the interview process? So they come across, right, people like them more. And I said, I don't think you've looked closely at my webpage, but so the answer is no. But again, this kind of narrative, right, which I think is a very gendered and sexist narrative, that the people who are responsible for attending to these discriminatory systems are the people most harmed by them, right? Like, I'm the one who is the problem. I need to fix myself so that I can exist in a system, in a game that is not made for me. And because so much of the rhetoric has always been that way, people tend to internalize these discriminatory systems, and they come to believe that they themselves are not capable of, right, like being successful, that the problem is them, and so on and so forth. And so I really thank you for pointing out that terminology of victim. I think part of the reason I'm doing that is because I really want to name that this is not something that you have created or responsible for, right? Like if you're having these feelings, but actually we are all living within these kinds of discriminatory systems that are impacting everyone, right? Like we have to be able to say, actually, let me take a step back and say, what is the pattern here? And once I begin to do that, I was thinking about your cartoon, Trista, like, yes, I'm stuck in hell, but also I have the opportunity for liberation because I'm naming the problem correctly, right? Because until I do that, again, I'm going to be looking in the mirror and yelling at the person in the mirror. And in fact, that only keeps us from moving forward. Whereas if we begin to say, okay, like we're being, victimized by these larger oppressive systems, then we can come together and we can say, okay, like how do we begin to attend to those? So anyway, I just wanted to say thank you, everybody, around your comments. But it really, it kind of helps me think too about, is the intent correct, or am I, evoking the right intent? And I'm trying to do that. I'm trying to say, please, let's stop having women being told they have imposter syndrome and start telling them, helping them understand they don't lack courage, they lack opportunity, right? They don't lack confidence, they lack positive reinforcement for their positive behaviors. So I'll stop there.
That's super fascinating. And I've just come on the heels. I was just recently in Banff for the ULEAD conference and was sitting on a panel for women educational leadership. And so definitely referenced your book, recommended it, and highlighted, some of the what we've been thinking about. But the conversation did come up that many of the women talked about their own imposter syndrome and their own inability. So I'm just wondering, in light of you just said, the conversation did go to that place. So and thinking about
this is the new hill. Yeah, this is the new hill I'm going to die on. I'm trying to disrupt that the idea that we're pathologizing a feeling that is natural based on right? Like if you think about something like Pavlovian even, right? Like if every time I speak up, someone tells me I'm not as smart as everybody else, or someone talks over me, which I just did to you, Trista. I'm so sorry. I interrupted you. Okay, I apologize. I got excited. Or, I say something and 15 minutes later, Bob says it and everyone's like, Bob, like that, like, thank you, Bob. And you're like, am I on Earth? Like, what just, the idea, or if I apply, this has happened, the other thing about the trajectories is, on average, they call it the glass escalator, at least in the American context, if you're a man and you're a teacher, you can anticipate, if you want to become an administrator in 5 to 6 years. Right? Purely by living in that body. If you're a white woman, we're looking at 10 to 12. If you were a woman of color, we're looking at 12 to 15 years. So imagine the amount of applications you put in, right, to move up during that timeline, and how many times people have said no. And if there's no context to it, you start to think, what else do I need to do to be able to be successful? What am I missing? Right? Which is why women are over-credentialed. So, again, this idea that we then twist that and say, actually, you should, go to a women's empowerment circle and beat some drums, and then all of a sudden, problem solved. I find that harmful, actually, right? Because it's just moving the conversation again into the realm of you are responsible for your own victimization, right, Rana, of this discriminatory system. And I just want to kill that entire trope.
Well, we cannot
you heard it here first.
Rania,
Jenny, you just reminded me, the first time I was thinking of doing a PhD, I approached this system and they were, supporting them with monetary. And I made an appointment, I sent my CV and I entered, and the comment was, well, don't you think you should do a master's first? And I said, oh, actually, I've done a master's and I've already done another graduate certificate. And he said, well, it's a lot of work. Aren't you married? And do you have children? Don't you think that will take a lot of time? Now, this is quite a few years back, but I still think that how that affected me in not going for it again for quite a few years later, because did they try to make me feel guilty because I have got 3 children and they needed me? Did I realize that? And I just thought how that must have affected me at the time. Looking back now, I see how much it did. Trista's eyes are just like, oh my gosh. But yes.
Well, the children, I mean, we haven't talked about that conversation as well, but they definitely came up on the panel for every single person presenting was the impact of having children and family and choices that we make or not make, and how that impacted the trajectory. Rania, what about you in conversation?
Um, I'm just echoing what you had mentioned, and one of my Arabic books, I mentioned something called management by killing, but killing not kind of killing actual murder, but it's just killing their ambitions or killing their inspire or aspiration of moving forward under different reasons, like what you had mentioned, Andrea, maybe you have children, or no, I'm taking care of you, so it's better for you not to move forward because that would affect 1, 2, 3. So sometimes even how we cover it, how we speak about it, we think that we're caring, but we're just limiting, or we're just let's say continue to discriminate or continue to follow a specific path without really providing opportunities or maybe supporting them in a different way if they think they are. Even if we see that they're not going to be successful for them, at least we provide a safe and positive, challenging environment for them to fail safe, even if they're not going to continue, but at least to have this positive experience and this opportunity for them. Yeah, I tried. This is not meant to be for me. I might be moving forward. And that goes for everything, like either for the examples you had mentioned in the book, Jenny, or maybe lots of things that we had faced ourselves. Maybe even when we're talking and we think that this is normal, but then when you're sharing those stories, you would recognize, no, that's not the case, and I would need to be careful about how we're moving it. But going back for what you had mentioned, Jenny, about reframing leadership, I find it kind of really interesting because everything that we're trying to do or to read is just trying to echo what the men in first place had established, and we're following the same rules, the same path, the same everything, and we're trying to label, or we're trying to justify, or to see how women are trying to work in that environment. But if we step back a little bit and try to see the bigger picture, what is it exactly needed for women, and what's the best way of women of doing things for them, and with everything else that's happening, it's not like we're going to divide the world, but it's just how we can really unleash the potential and help see things differently to utilize the resources, the experiences, what we really are capable of doing and we need to be doing. I think that's what was one of the things you mentioned in the book about the motherhood, and having this kind of concept that women is only for being at home or dealing with children, but also that maybe something she wishes to continue or she excels in, but if we provide it in a different way, in a different rules or a different legal format, that she or he or whatever gender would be able to deal with the situation and with those expectations, if I express my idea or my.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what you're talking about in some ways, and I think again, how are we thinking about discrimination being operationalized? Like, I think it's easier for us to understand discrimination being operationalized as like, I don't like women and I don't think they're smart enough to be in charge, right? Like that feels very clear that that's, discriminatory. I think what's less obvious is Andrea's story, right? Or Ronnie, the story that you provided, in the sense that benevolent sexism is still a form of sexism, right? Which is that women have a special role. And to your point, if you want to have that role, like, that's wonderful, but everyone should feel like they have choices, right? But in that story, in that scenario, you're not being given a choice, you're being dictated to about where I believe you belong, which is not the same, right? But I think we don't attend to this kind of what we might call benevolent sexism, which is the idea that actually I'm putting you in a special category and uplifting these kind of stereotype feminized qualities, but it's still sexist, right? It's still discriminatory because the choice has been removed from you, and I am evoking, right? I am deciding your ability to access a PhD program based on that discriminatory, prescriptive, stereotyped idea, right? And that's very, very problematic. I'd also just say, and then I saw your question, Elizabeth, so I'll get to that in a second. But I'd also just say that, yes, this is about women, and yes, the reframing that I'm interested in is one that is more expansive, that would facilitate a reconceptualization that would allow women a larger parameter of behavior to, right? Not two doors, but many doors. Hopefully not in hell though, Trista, but you know, across the spectrum. But I actually believe that's good for everybody, right? Like the idea that that someone identifying as male would be harangued for showing care is also problematic, right?
Or celebrated. Or
what
celebrated for
or celebrated,
celebrated for
right?
showing care. You know?
Well, I think it depends what that care looks like. I think it depends. But my own, again, you know, I think my only point is what we want is and we want reflections of what we know is effective, right? Like the tropes around leadership are not well aligned with what we know when we live in organizations that are run well and we thrive, right? Like having a dictatorial autocratic leader who, you know, makes decisions and tells everybody to follow them along. Nobody, I mean, maybe some people want to work in that kind of environment. I certainly don't. And the research would play that out. So thank you for that. Anyway, I just, you know, again, I think that's an opportunity so that I remember one summer when it was summer salary time, I went to the budget person and I was like, you know, can you let me know, like, when will my money be released so I can work on my project? And he said, yes, because I know you'll want to be home this summer with your sons. And I said, no, I'm asking because I want to be able to do my work. But it was like, you know, it sort of took my breath away in that moment where I was like, that's how you think of me? Like I'm not being taken seriously. And it was, you know, it was like this sharp jab moment, which is so small, but clearly, right, like around what body I occupy, not something else. So anyway, I've had many of those too. Would you like me to answer that question, or do you want to add something in between,
Yeah.
Trista?
Well, we did highlight one of the interesting parts in your book was the talk about the glass labyrinth, the glass ceiling, the glass cliff, and some of these ideas. And so I love that, Elizabeth, I do think you should pick up the book for sure. But yeah, if we can have the author share a little bit around some of these ideas, especially when it comes to intersectionality. I think that has another level when it comes to what pathways, like the labyrinth being, and when you said that statistic around uh, some men and their trajectory forward, it's a pretty straight up escalator to the top, where the labyrinth does feel a bit, when you're in it, doing roles that are leadership, very important school leadership roles that are just undervalued, unrecognized a lot of the time, but help keep a school functioning and moving forward and are essential. And so sometimes that push-pull of whether or not it's open for you to move to the next leadership role, because the school might collapse without you, is the feeling people can give you. So the labyrinth was interesting for me. It hadn't been one I'd seen before, but then I think we're also talking about the glass cliff as well.
Yeah, I'll start with that just because it's a little more straightforward. So, and this actually goes to this whole question of like how we frame things, right? Like around imposter syndrome and those. So this is another one that I'm interested in reframing. But so the glass cliff was actually two British researchers, and they were responding to some articles in, I guess, the Times London about somebody had looked and said, okay, here's all the Fortune 500, they're, you know, the FTSE index, and the ones that are poorly performing, look, they're also run by women. They're too for women are terrible leaders. Because, you know, correlation equals causation. And they were like, can we, let's have a little like chat about that. So they went and they looked, and basically what they found was that women had been hired once the organization was in decline. Right. So and there's a whole host of things that come with that, but I'll leave that there. So the idea there is that, you know, after a glass ceiling, meaning I made it to the CEO position or I made it to the super and principal position, I'm actually though in a highly, like, you know, I'm on a precipice, and I'm on a precipice because the only time the opportunity opens up is when people feel that you know, we can risk it, sort of, right? Or, you know, there's a saying that's sort of, this is back in sort of the organizational leadership literature from a million years ago, which is think leader, think male, and they say think crisis, think female. Right. So of course, right? All these, beggars can't be choosers. And so women take on these positions, but there's a lot of repercussions if they fail. And there are also not as many benefits if they succeed. So it's quite complicated. And, one of the hard things about it is it describes a phenomenon, but it doesn't talk about the causes of that phenomenon, which is why I think it's important to kind of talk about it within the context of discrimination and benevolent sexism and so on and so forth. So the reason I bring that all up is to answer the second, which is what is a glass cushion? So one of the thought experiments that I've been thinking about is framing, because I think framing is really important in terms of how we think about solutions. But I read somewhere that, what if we thought about the problem not as women being pushed to the edge, but men being unfairly given the cushiest positions consistently, right? Using their sort of homophilic networks, meaning, people like them, to give them warnings or to constantly place them, regardless of whether or not necessarily they're the most qualified or the most capable, or even amongst many capable people, the positions that are the ones that are the most likely to succeed. And I just think that's a very interesting way of framing things, because I just wondered, right? Like, again, most of the conversation around Glass Cliff, because of the way it's been framed, is about how do you steel yourself or get resources together or advocate for resources so that it's not as painful when you're like you can put a parachute on. But not many of the conversation is like, let's stop doing this, right? And I don't know who the people who are deciding are, but I do think reframing and naming, right? Like, there's an unfair advantage based on right how this phenomenon plays out. Maybe we should limit that unfair advantage rather than constantly tell people, right, like, work twice as hard in a very difficult situation. So that's the juxtaposition. In terms of pathway, I think, this goes back to, and I'm getting kind of obsessed with feminization as a framework, because this idea is that women are being funneled into jobs that are feminized. So coaching, teacher leadership, other kinds of supports, right, that are of high value. I'm not suggesting they're not of high value substantively, but because women do them and they have stereotyped feminized identities, we devalue them. But I also think that women are not being told that. So what happens is women consistently take on these other positions, believing that that grants them access to more authority and opportunity. And in fact, it's pushing them down a different lane of the labyrinth. Right? So, like, for example, I'm doing a study right now. Again, forgive me, this is the US context. So like something like, let's say our state education leaders, 5% of them are women, okay, of all the states. There are literally some states in the United States in which there are no female superintendents, by the way, or one. But when you look at special education leaders, like the next tier down, 95% of them are women. 95%.
That totally tracks.
Like, what? Right. So I used to say, male, sort of like teaching is feminized, leadership is not. And I'm trying to change that a little bit, which is I'm saying some kinds of leadership are not. We're fine with women being leaders as long as they're the kinds of leaders that match the stereotype and they don't get access to other things. Like, we're totally comfortable, right? Like funneling them into the associate, in our case, associate superintendent position, where they do all the work that the superintendent gives them. And they believe by doing that, they're preparing themselves to take on a leadership role, but they never get promoted. And
Well, and
I'm finding that very interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
Just it also could be the role that has the biggest pushback, because working in special education is an awfully tricky space to be in. So you can create negative. So when coming through to the final next step, like, again, if we look at the glass cushion, what roles are we taking on? Is it making change that are actually really confrontational at times or difficult? And that could be another barrier that happens. And I'm really thinking a lot about crisis in the sense of, we can't ignore the recent pandemic that we've experienced and the crisis that happened and what the state of schools are currently and the lack of leaders. So what's going to happen with women who are taking on roles that maybe are not, they aren't supported, they are difficult schools, but they're available. So what that looks like. Andrea, I saw you in your face, you had some definitely things to respond to as Jenny was talking.
No, I'm just, you're saying things and I'm like, oh yes, yes, I'm just agreeing with things that have been said. Yeah, no, I'm just doing a lot of thinking and reflecting on what you're saying. So, Rania?
Yeah.
So as Andrea would be also sharing lots of wisdom and insights, I would be focusing on the teacher leadership component because that's an area I'm specialized in. It's very interesting to see most of the scholars or most of the authors are females. And in a recent meeting that I attended, like even white men were telling like there is no much recognition in conferences and association regarding teacher leadership. And they were trying to question, trying to find like there's no much kind of a promotion or progression or even recognition in the academic context of what is teacher leadership and how we can take it further. And that will take us also back. I will have lots of questions. I know that we might not be able to answer them due to the time, but you had mentioned lots about second shift, and I think that will take us back also to the concept of motherhood, regardless if we're talking about moms or we're talking about parenting. It's just the concept of having this quality time of children, or how we're taking care of families and family cohesion, especially at this time of everything like rapid changes and stress and we're facing around us. But we don't want women or men to be taken away from families and from homes and leaving the children alone, just in the concept of that I want to be promoted or I want to progress within my career. So there's something that we need to balance, and we need to make sure that how we're role modeling this even for the new generations or for our own families. The second thing you also had, and lots of things, but one of the things that I would like to highlight is the emotional labor and the invisible labor that you had been referring to a lot. And I think we might had been in lots of those kind of situations where, for me, it was not like differentiating between emotional and visible labors, but it's sometimes we want to be positive and we want to encourage others. It's not like I want to pretend or to fake something that I don't have, or I'm making another version of myself, as much as we're trying to encourage and motivate and look at the positive opportunities that around us. So I think there's a fine line between those two cases or two situations that we find ourselves in. You might like to get.
Yeah, I would say so for part one, absolutely. I mean, I think, patriarchy and capitalistic society are quite intertwined, right? Like the idea of overwork and taking people from their families and valuing work over other things, and that's highly problematic. I would say though, and again, my specialty is not the family unit, so I want to be careful and kind of treading on that. But I would say, again, the problem isn't necessarily about, as I'm understanding it, isn't necessarily about women's forcing women to make that choice. To me, it's really the distribution of work. And what I mean by that is today, again, in my context, more women work outside the home and are the primary breadwinners for their family than ever before, but they also have the least amount of free time that they've ever had, right? Like, in fact, men do less when you're in a differentiated couple, gendered couple, men do less of the home-based labor today than they did in the 1960s. So I just don't know how it's possible. And here's another trope that I'm trying to kind of get rid of, which is the idea when people ask about like work-life balance, I'm trying to like ban that entire construct, right? Because balance suggests that actually I am doing something wrong, and it's not that actually I'm being asked to do too much in both places. It's that I can't handle, right, the fair amount of work that's been given to me, and I need to balance it. And I just find that to be very difficult. So to your point is, I think people should be able to do whatever balance that makes sense to them. But again, when it feels like it isn't a choice, I think that's where I start to feel itchy, right? Like where I feel like I don't have a partner who's supportive, or we've never even had a conversation about it, or, I show up places. I mean, still to this day, I show up places. I was at ARA. Thank you. I love that work integration. I'm gonna steal that. Thank you, Elizabeth. I call it interface, work-life interface, but I think integration is even nicer. You know, I show up at a conference and people literally like, who's taking care of the kids? I'm like, I left them chained in the basement with a bowl of food. Like what do you think is happening? You know, and at first I thought, why do people keep asking me this question? And then I started to understand why they were asking me that question, because they're suggesting I shouldn't be there. I should be at home. So again, it's not, again, I would have rather been with my kids, to be honest. But again, I don't feel like I'm being positioned to have a choice, you know?
And I mean, I think it brings, we've had an opportunity. This is our 12th book session. I know we've got to wrap up because I'm looking at the
Oh,
time.
I'm sorry.
No apologies. It's been fabulous. I mean, I'd love to continue the conversation, but you know, there's only so much appetite for long conversations and recorded, so stay tuned. But you know, the idea of what is actually in place for structures of work. So is the leadership role desirable for anyone, not just women? The long work hours, the challenges, the tensions that exist. So we've been really lucky to look at different ways of working, and that where the job shares. I was reminded of that, Andrea and Rania, in the book we read around, you know, principals sharing a role, like how hard it was for them to have that opportunity, how difficult it was for them to navigate, but how successful it was for them personally. So, but is that even a possibility? And perhaps that would open up space for women without children to have other items of their life to be able to. So it's not about, you know, women with children who then have a specific need. It's beneficial to all. And so the structures of the workplace need to be addressed. And that's what I was really, as I was thinking through this book, is that it's not the individual. Again, we need to be looking at the organization and the structures that are in place. And that's what I love about these conversations is we're trying to figure out, then the next step is, okay, well, how? So
that's my thing, is it's great now, how do we actually action and do this? So
well, and then, you know,
my
like who's in superintendency, sorry, Rania, who's in superintendency, because policy changes happen or possibilities happen with different people in the position. And if we're looking at the numbers, who's making the big director decisions or are maybe not thinking about these issues. Rania, go ahead. I cut you off.
And just also continuing, I think this is for K to 12 or school level. I think we need to have another one, Jenny, and we're encouraging you for higher ed. So that's something. Or maybe informal education, you would never know. So that's just to continue.
I know they always say, right? Like all research is research. And this is definitely some research because you know, it's like every day there's something else that's happening that you're like, you know, okay, you know, go back to your book and you're like, okay, be brave, you know.
my question would be the unrecognized work that the women do to try and get their foot in the door for leadership. Do the men do that sort of work, or is it always they get the recognized, they are work smarter and not maybe harder, if you know what I mean? Or do women need to, or is
yeah. I would reframe that. So back to the pathways thing, you know, men's pathways look quite different. I don't think that men know something that women don't. I think men are acknowledged for things that women are acknowledged for, right? So again, I just would say, you know, one of the, and again, to your point, Rana, about like the academy, you know, we have a merit structure. You might think about this as a promotion structure too. And, you know, they say service matters, but it doesn't. Right? It doesn't, meaning we're supposed to be doing this care work and so on and so forth. And I, you know, we could change those parameters. They're just made up. We just made them up, right? Like we can actually change them and ask people about how much hours they're spending. We could have surveys from students about whether or not they feel cared for, right? And we could use that criteria if we really do value it, which supposedly we do in schools, right? As part of our promotion materials. Like there are actually ways of capturing some of to uninvisible the invisible. And when it's uninvisible, it is harder for people to say this person is more qualified than this person and they lack all these criteria.
Yeah.
But as long as it's invisible, right? Like we're always going to defer to bias.
And having just gone for full professorship, I wonder how much your care work featured in your promotional component. So thinking about like what do we actually value, what seems to matter, And I love that, making the invisible visible and valued. I'm going to draw us to a close. I know our conversation would continue, but I think this is a good movement into our next book, especially when we are, as we end this conversation. And again, it's such an honor to have you with us, Jenny, and to be sharing in the conversation, because it's, you know, there's lots of questions that we have, and to be able to bounce back and forth with you and see what you were thinking when you were writing it with Monica as well is just such an opportunity for us. But so here we're looking at women interrupting, disrupting, and revolutionizing educational policy and practice. And I think that idea of disruption and revolution is of where we're sort of landing today, and thinking about how do we not just settle, but how can we play some really important roles moving forward? Any final thoughts, Andrea, Rania, as we close? We haven't picked our date fully yet. It's going to be July. We're just, you know, wrestling through making sure that it was our interface, our our way of working says for us as well. Andrea, Rania?
No, I just want to thank Jenny for coming along with our informal chat today. Thank you so much. I also want to mention Maria wasn't here today. She usually joins us, but unfortunately couldn't make it. I was just going to read out what Elizabeth wrote. Men do not recognize the salty water they are swimming in that gives them the greater buoyancy or access to leadership pathways. I thought that was really well written, sharing, Elizabeth. So thank you for that. Rania?
And I will also thank you all thank you, Trista, for leading this, Andrea also for organizing, and Jenny for attending, Elizabeth, Jenny. I think the conversation would also continue via the X, Twitter, whatever the platform's name is these days. And there are lots of ways that we can also continue to navigate and to see how we can take this conversation further, and the information, the insights that you had shared via the book. There are lots of things for us also to reflect and to think about. How we can support ourselves and how we can support others, and how we can start sharing more stories to be more, or to raise awareness regarding what is it exactly happening, what to accept, what not to accept, and how we can start having those small changes on the long run, that it will be this big movement. I hope then after 50 years, we will witness something else, even if we will not be there to witness it. Thank you again, Jenny, and thank you everyone for having us. Thank you, Elizabeth, Jenny, also for joining. Thank you.